Hey guys, my name is Chad. I'm the owner of Perfect Clicks LLC. We've built over 750 websites over the last 12 years. So we've seen everything from, websites going just loading slowly to today where we are, where performance really matters. Everything needs to load within 2 seconds. And you're probably going to hit some issues with a Largest Contentful Paint, which is your LCP, or you're probably hitting issues with render blocking, especially if you're using Elementor or Perfmatters. There's a lot of settings that have very advanced nuances. In fact, I probably don't recommend anybody who is a just a business owner or doesn't have technical knowledge, or even if you're new, you may not want to touch these settings, and you probably should definitely take a backup and reach out to a professional because it takes a hell of a lot of experience to even learn these details. So I'm going to share with you some of the details about how to get those CSS files and those JS files to actually not block the rendering of the page, which is what increases your LCP. So you want to decrease the time that it takes to get to that page load, right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about in the video today. I mean, if you want a quick answer, I would say just, you know, compress your CSS. You could do that with WP Rocket or with Perfmatters, but there's a reason why we use Perfmatters. And you can also just, you know, delay or defer your JavaScript, but your site might not work. So we're going to go through all of the resources that we found that's out there so far. Things are continue to improve, the speed and the standards that continue to elevate. And so you really have to keep up with this stuff because, guys, we've made changes to websites, and we just changed like 4 words on a website and the conversions jumped 500%. Can you imagine when your site loads just half a second faster, how many more conversions are going to come in, how many more sales, and how much that means to your business? So this is something that we've done, and we've actually seen it. The sales just completely pour in when we optimize this way, and the sales completely drop off when the site isn't loading. So if you're looking strictly at a core vitals scenario, I wouldn't just look at core vitals anymore. It's not enough to have a 99 or a 100 score, lighthouse score, or a speed score. You got to look at how is the site really loading, and what is the order of the CSS and the JavaScript, and how can you eliminate render blocking, but also collect all the data that you want to have so that you can have your scripts, like your tracking scripts, working. You can have your conversion scripts or your forms and your sales data. So you want your site to look good and load well. Also collect the right data, because that data is going to be what you use to leverage and scale your site. And also make sure that your site is loading really, really well and can scale and handle that traffic. Because what we're also seeing is as you scale up these sites, there's just so much traffic that there's new challenges and problems as you hit 100,000 visitors a month, or 1 million visitors a month, or 10 million. So like you have to be able to handle all of those traffic levels. In this video, we're going to show you that we did probably 50 to 100 different tests to optimize these settings. We'll show you all of the settings. We'll show you the resources. We even reached out to Elementor support. We'll tell you what they told us. We spoke with our hosting provider, and ultimately, if you're using Elementor with a really fast host, I'll drop all these links in the comments below or in the description below. You really need to structure your site well, and then it does come down to the code. So even if you have the Elementor theme, you're using Perfmatters, and you're using a really fast WordPress managed host, check out what we use. We're using the Hello Elementor theme. We're using the Perfmatters plugin. We're going to dial in on the settings, and then we also have a super fast host. We'll leave the link below for that as well. With all of that, and then with caching, you're still going to hit issues. It's unbelievable. But this is the 1 or 2% difference that is going to separate your online business from everybody else. And so it's going to drive more conversions, and it's definitely worth it. So let's jump into the video. If you guys have any questions, do leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you do need help from our team at Perfect Clicks, the email is info@perfectclicks.com, or you can give us a call at 844-4CLICKS. Let's jump into it. All right, so the first thing you want to do is make sure that your host is working, right? I'm going to save you guys so much time just by knowing, is the issue at your host? And we do recommend pretty much 1 or 2 hosting providers. I do have a video on the best managed WordPress hosting. Definitely check that out, or we'll leave a link down below. But You could see here, in this hosting case, we were clearing the cache and making some changes, so there were some bumps. But for the most part, if the response time or time to first byte, which is TTFB, is less than 2 milliseconds, or if it's ideally at 1 millisecond, that's quite fast, right? And you're going to see there's a big difference between there's all these TTFB checkers. They're good, but they're not always great in terms of access to your website, right? You want people to access your website, but it also has to render really quickly. And so that's where you get into, the First Contentful Paint. It really measures how long it takes to render, and that's where render blocking becomes an issue. So first, make sure it's not your hosting. If it is your hosting, we're happy to help you move it. We have some pretty crazy deals on hosting, and we'll set you up with all of them. So just reach out to us. But make sure it's not your hosting, right? Second, it's probably your theme, right? And it's the theme that you're using. And so what we did, we tested on a default installation of Elementor and of WordPress and Elementor, right? So you could see if it's not your host, what does it look like on a WordPress with just Elementor, nothing else, basic install. In fact, actually on this website, I think it doesn't even have rows or columns or anything. This is literally just Elementor out of the box. And so what we found here is that, so as you can see here, there is about 734 milliseconds just to get to that, to start loading, essentially, to get to the server, the initial request. And then what you're going to see is a lot of CSS files. And so the way Elementor works is it generates CSS files for all the different elements and widgets. That's what makes Elementor such a versatile theme and platform to use. And then you'll also see that there's a lot of JavaScript files that are used. So between those CSS files and those JavaScript files, you're going to end up loading right under that 2-second mark anyway, which is pretty good because that's what Google considers that first contentful paint. However, you're still going to get that notice that with all these X's here that you have render blocking, and that's going to impact your LCP anyway. So what you need to do is basically, our goal is to eliminate all the CSS loading and the JavaScript loading before the important elements on the page. The only problem is, to make your page look good, you need that CSS and JavaScript as well. So how do you balance this out? Because it's the more features, the more plugins, and the more things that are on your website, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to make it fast and load in what priority. So you got to think of it as, we have to prioritize the right CSS files or prioritize the right JavaScript files. And then also something that you want to think about is the tracking. So once again, guys, this stuff, do take a backup. Make sure you know what you're doing, because we're not responsible if you make any changes and break your site, because this stuff matters. But this will save you a lot of time, because you'll know, okay, it's not my host and it's not my theme. And it's not even an issue with Elementor necessarily out of the box. And to confirm this, we reached out to Elementor support. So here's what Elementor support had to say. They said that they received our message and, they really want to get back to us. We gave them some information. What's really interesting is you can look into your Elementor and system info and see if there's any conflicts or errors. That's usually a really good trick to fix some things off the bat if you're having loading issues. And you'll also see that Elementor themselves wanted to make sure, is this an Elementor issue, right? Is it Elementor Pro issue? And so the truth is, Elementor and Elementor Pro generate CSS files. So you have even more CSS files loading, and it seems like a lot if you really aren't familiar with it. So I actually thought it was a lot as well. They recommended to, deactivate all the plugins, which I did, and we checked it out, and it wasn't a conflict on that front. They also recommended to change the CSS print method to internal embedding and then save those changes. I'm not a huge fan of the internal embedding, because that's going to actually increase the amount of HTML that's on the page, or the amount of code. So there's this concept called HTML to content, or to code to content ratio. And so I actually did a video on that. You could check it out. But that's one of the major reasons why we use Perfmatters versus WP Rocket, because WP Rocket will really increase the amount of HTML and code on the page. And it really has to do with the CSS there. So we actually ended up using internal embedding. I'll go into the settings in a little bit. But you also, and they also recommended using the regenerate CSS and data, and this regenerating the CSS files and data. These are all good recommendations. However, as you'll see in this next section, it didn't work. They were able to confirm though that Elementor and Elementor Pro and additional plugins will load multiple CSS files, and that everything is kind of operating the way it should. And so I think that's really important, because that means our hosting is set and our theme is set. And I'll also leave a link to Elementor down below as well. But like, you have really good infrastructure in place. Now, what you have to do is you have to work with your site load speed, your hosting environment, your caching settings, and your optimization. You want to satisfy your LCP and your core vitals for Google, but you also want performance and tracking so that you could grow your business. So here's what we did. We took a site that had tons of CSS files and images loading and JS files, and we started to work with the settings to compress it. I'm just going to show you some of the results before we get into the settings. As you'll see here, there's a number of CSS files that need to be either compressed, you can concrete them, you can concatenate them, you can combine all of those files, and that'll work too, but you're going to have performance issues, you're going to have load issues. And then here you'll see we start to compress how many CSS files are being loaded. And that's actually done using removing unused CSS, which is really great. You want to streamline what is the critical CSS to get only that to load, and then start to prefetch and do all the preloading and things like that as well. You'll see here, we continue to see, even with less CSS, we're getting better load times, and we're just kind of compressing what needs to happen. Eventually, you'll see here, we got it down to about one line, which is the CSS file, which this is kind of how this is how Elementor will compress your CSS files. And actually, this is also how Perfmatters works with it. And so this will only give you one file to load with CSS, and that makes a huge difference. And you'll see it really compresses the load time of all of these elements. Then you still have to deal with the JavaScript as well. One thing to note here is that even when you have more CSS, take a look at that initial load. It can still be right around 900 milliseconds or maybe 1100 milliseconds. So as you pay attention to that initial load as you're going through and testing, and just seeing that, okay, even with the CSS or JavaScript files, that doesn't really impact that initial load, which means that you can't just solve render blocking, just with the server. I mean, your server is consistent, but you also, it's not like your JavaScript and your CSS impacts that initial load as much as some hosting providers might want you to think. And in fact, we've had hosting providers tell us that, but it's not true. So here you could see we actually streamlined the CSS, and we also deferred and delayed some of the JavaScript. Now that made a huge difference, because now we went from making well over 75 requests to we're making less than 30 requests or about 20 requests. And that's including tracking. For us, we really prioritize the tracking on any website, but we're going to still have some performance issues depending on what JavaScript is loading. So what you want to do is add back some of the JavaScript and start to take out what you don't need. And I'll show you a shortcut for how do you know what to use or not. So as you can see here, we're getting closer to testing the right amount of CSS, what's being consolidated, what's being excluded. And what's interesting to think about is this is unique for every single website. So you really have to take the time to get it right. But again, like I said, the results are there. But in this case, when a server does have about a half a second extra load time, that can really impact your core vitals, because everything gets pushed back another half second. And you really want your initial page load, your first contentful paint, you still want that below 2 seconds. So just watch out for that when you're testing. It's going to have some variability sometimes, but ultimately you want to compress as much as you can. And you can see here, we're getting closer to the results of what we're testing. And eventually we actually added back in a lot of JavaScript without hurting too much of that contentful paint. So let's talk about the actual settings that got us these results, right? You have two options to manage your JavaScript. And if you don't understand this difference between deferring JavaScript and delaying JavaScript, you should probably not make any of these changes. So this is really important. When you defer JavaScript, that means you're going to load that JavaScript at the end of the page. That means the scripts that are there that are deferred will load. They'll just load at the end of the page. When you delay the JavaScript, that means that the scripts will not load until after the page is loaded and the user takes an action. Now, this is very dangerous for anybody who's running an e-commerce or a conversion-based website, which everybody should be, even if you're selling services, because you could actually miss out on traffic and conversions if your JavaScript is delayed. Because somebody could go to your website and not move and maybe click to something, and you will not be able to track that conversion. And so it's very important to choose carefully what are the elements that you're going to defer as JavaScript and what are you going to delay. Now, in our case, we found a lot of material online that recommended, keeping the jQuery, loading that first, right? That's going to help everything after that in terms of JavaScript. That'll help it load faster. And then for us, we also want our tracking code to be loading first. So for some of you might be using Google tag.js, or you might be using Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics. A lot of these JavaScript tracking codes will take up a lot of time on your website. We do have a video about how to minimize the tracking load on your site by using Google Tag or gtag.js, so you can check out that video as well. But in our case, we wanted to exclude the tracking scripts and the jQuery from the deferred JavaScript, which means those assets are going to load sooner. They're not being deferred, and they're definitely not being delayed. Now, the other thing is, if you're using Elementor with Perfmatters, you want to make sure that the delayed scripts, if you choose to delay any of the Elementor scripts, you may have to check off the box to exclude Elementor. Now, if you use Elementor search high up on the page, maybe you want to exclude the Elementor search. But in our case, we were able to exclude the Elementor JS files, and that will keep your forms working well. If there's any other custom, loading or animations or anything like that that you're using with Elementor, that'll help that. So just make sure that for your site to work, you may not be able to delay the Elementor. It depends, but if you have a form that's below the fold, it might be fine because they have to take an action to get to that form to work anyway, and then it loads. So like I said, guys, it's all very unique to the website. What is your purpose? What's the actual conversion actions that you want your users to take? And it's a trade-off between performance and functionality and speed and tracking. So next, we hit on this earlier, you're going to want to remove your unused CSS. This is probably a better option in most cases, not every case, than just injecting all that CSS in line, or maybe combining all the files into one file. What we did here was we combined the features of Perfmatters and Elementor. And so what we did was we removed the unused CSS, which does work really well in Perfmatters, right? They have two options here. We chose the file option, but I'll show you the combination with that and Elementor. Even if you use the file option here instead of the inline default, there's a bunch of documentation on that. You can check out Perfmatters. I'll leave their link below as well. But you can use that in combination with the CSS print method for Elementor, right? And so this is a unique combination that we tested out and we saw that difference. The next thing you can do is delay the style sheet behavior. So it's going to delay the CSS from loading right away. And ultimately, that's going to remove a lot of the CSS files that you don't need. And it's going to have that, it's going to reduce the render blocking, right? Because it's going to push the CSS to load a little bit later so the priority items can load faster. Additionally, you're going to want to test this with your website. You're going to look at if lazy loading is going to impact with that CSS. So in our case, we found that Elementor's lazy loading, image loading, Gutenberg loading, and lazy loading background images
were the best settings in this case. But that really depends. What does the initial load of your site look like? And what kind of images are you using? And so in this case, that's kind of where you might have to play around a little bit. But combining those lazy loads with the CSS delays, you can exclude it if you need to, but I think that's fine. The other thing you need to watch out for is that you need to clear the used CSS from Perfmatters to kind of refresh it, because also Elementor is building CSS files. So what you'll have to do is also go back into Elementor and regenerate the files and data. Again, you have to have a backup before you do anything. But in my experience, that doesn't really do much, but it refreshes it, right? So you're gonna have to regenerate those files and data. You're gonna have to clear the unused CSS. Then you gotta flush your cache. You might have an edge cache or a CDN cache. You gotta flush that. And then you might have an object cache. So if you're making these changes and you don't see, that Google's picking up all your tests, or that the web page test waterfall isn't changing, it's probably because it's not picking up these new CSS changes. So just keep in mind, you have to clear it at the Perfmatters level, at the Elementor level, at the host level, and even at the CDN level. So you want to make sure all of that is optimized. So guys, those are the two big items, right? If you have your JavaScript deferred and delayed properly, and the CSS files being kind of combined or removed, rather, if you're removing those CSS files and also delaying them properly and having it work with Elementor really well, that's probably going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm going to just give you a few other tips that I found that will be helpful if you're already working on this. In addition to getting your first contentful paint reduced and just getting that time compressed as much as you can, preloading is going to help you with the largest contentful paint as well. And so what you can do is preload some of the background images or the key images or assets that are needed. And so that'll jump those right up to the top. So what we chose to do was we optimized those for the jQuery JavaScript file, which may change. So you got to watch out. If that version ever changes or there's an update, you may have to, update that as well. But we preloaded some of the key assets. That's going to help your largest contentful paint. You can even do things like a fetch priority, and you can prioritize it by the div class or the element that you want loaded first. Very interesting stuff. The other thing is you can add a DNS prefetch, which means that if there's some tracking code or an external call, which many sites have an external call, you can preload that, and that's going to help that load faster as well as the waterfall goes through. So now that we've seen some of these tips, so a few other items I just want to mention is that you can optimize all your icons. That's something we didn't do. You could probably go through individually and take out some of the Elementor JavaScripts if you need to. Perfmatters does allow you to optimize fonts really well, although we found that using it with Elementor is probably best. And then you could just go through and really optimize any unnecessary scripts or plugins that are there. There's usually plenty of opportunities. And I think even the next layer is just optimizing how it's built within Elementor or a really fast page builder. You really want to have the best themes, the fastest loading tools and plugins and everything like that. So I would say really be careful about what theme you choose. You can use WP Rocket. I would say use Perfmatters if you're using Elementor. I'll leave that in the link below as well. But definitely be careful with all this stuff because your business is relying on this infrastructure, right? So let's just look at some of the results. As you can see here in PageSpeed Insights, you have the first contentful paint, but you still have the performance that's a little bit low. This was in some of the testing. Guys, we've gone through having the right host, having the right theme, having the right configurations on your Perfmatters plugin. And so now we're just going to go through and look at, okay, when that first contentful paint is below 2 seconds, your largest contentful paint is below 4 seconds, you're going to have very, very fast load times. Even on mobile, I mean, a 1.2 second first contentful paint and a 1.7 second first contentful paint, these are excellent load times. But you'll notice that it might only happen when the cache is hitting. So you got to make sure that the cache isn't hitting and you run it a couple of times, run it on different pages and do your test, because here's what happens when you do your test, and that first contentful paint is at 1.9 seconds. Now, it's only half a second difference, right? So you have to be able to know where is the issue, and a lot of times that issue is in the render blocking at the CSS and JavaScript level, file level. So, and that's going to impact your first contentful paint and your largest contentful paint. So to optimize those, just kind of go through, test it out. You may see more differences as you go along, but eventually you're going to get the results that you want, and it's going to be 1.2 seconds, 1.7 seconds. And so in closing, guys, this really makes a big difference if you're able to have the core vitals, but the core vitals is not the end all. Don't optimize your site just to get hundreds across the board or all green. You want the site to load in a way that delivers the best experience and gives you the most data and tracking for your business. So you can optimize your site to drive more conversions, more sales, more inquiries, whatever it is that you're looking to do. So eliminate your render blocking, test your site. Don't just stop at core vitals, test it all the way through, optimize your site, and you'll see. I can almost guarantee this. I won't because it's on YouTube, but I can almost guarantee that if you lower your page speed, your conversions will skyrocket just by doing speed optimization and performance. And now speed optimization and performance is also being impacted by SEO. So if you're doing SEO, if you're doing paid ads, if you're doing any marketing on your website and you want to get a 2, 3, 4, 5x increase on your results, do this. So if you guys need any help, please do reach out to us at info@perfectclicks.com or 8444-clicks. And if this video did help you in any way, I really would appreciate it if you leave a like and do subscribe. That way we can stay in touch. And we look forward to helping you in the future. See you in the next video.